Welcome to Miss Amen's video lecture series on Big Era 2, Human Beings Almost Everywhere, 200,000 years ago to 10,000 BCE. In this unit, we're going to be looking at how man evolves into man. So who is his closest ancestor, and how does he get to be a human being? What defines him as a human? And then we will look a little bit at how he spread out through the world. We'll investigate that further in class with different video resources and readings, but for now we're just going to get kind of the basic overview. So let's begin. So, Homo sapiens evolved from Homo erectus, and that was around 200,000 years ago. People who seem to be like us. We find skeletons of those already living in Africa. Now, what's interesting to note with that is the fact that although called Homo sapiens, we are entitled Homo sapiens sapiens. Those people are probably, are known as the Cro-Magnon people. So keep that part in mind. Human origins are in Africa, as I said, 200,000 years ago, and at about that time, 100,000 years ago, we finally have the true anatomically and genetically us emerge out in Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, even though they're genetically and they seem to look and body shape seems to be like us, we notice that there's some things that seem to stand out that they haven't quite met the leap to us quite yet. That'll be between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. So, Homo sapiens traveled further, much further than Homo erectus. And in fact, you can just guess that from where does everybody live today? So they left the African homeland and they began to spread out. They began to migrate and live into different locations. And let's take a look at exactly what locations they migrated to. So the first, there's the origins right there in Eastern Africa. And that's around, and that was when 200,000, 250,000 years ago, somewhere in that date range. And it's not until 100,000 years ago, before they start to move up north and further west into Africa, and they start to migrate a little bit into Southwest Asia. From there, they take a coastal route, it appears, to Australia, and they get there around 60,000 years ago. So keep in mind that the water levels were much lower than they are today, hence a coastal route would have been very possible. In fact, most of the Pacific Islands, there was much more landmass there, so they probably weren't traveling as much by boat. They get to Europe around 40,000 years ago. And what's interesting is they also make it all the way to Siberia by 40,000 years ago. And when we watch the film The Journey of Man, we'll find out that in between that triangle between Siberia, little past India there, and Europe, in the center there is actually what we would call the nursery of mankind. It was located in Kazakhstan, and that's really where man kind of travels to and then spreads out from there into Siberia, China, Europe, etc. They enter North America around 12,000 to 30,000 years ago, although I would like you to keep in mind that that date is in question currently. New evidence has arrived, and there's a possibility that might not have been the case. It might have actually been even longer than that, so around 3,000 to 10,000, somewhere in there. So keep that in mind. At this point, though, when they move into North America, as I was saying, the Ice Age had actually locked up a lot of the water, so what it also did was it caused, where the Rocky Mountains, from the end of Alaska all the way to the Midlands in America was all locked up as glaciers. So they couldn't actually get anywhere beyond Alaska in and of itself for quite some time. They make it finally, in a very short period of time actually, to Chile, all the way down to Chile. So through Mexico and all over South America, somewhere around 12 to 13,000 years ago. Again, if the numbers have changed, the new evidence is suggesting that might have actually been a much later date. So those are in flux, but for now we'll just go with those numbers, because that's the standard belief in the community as of today. But once the Ice Age ends, there's a corridor that runs through the Rocky Mountains that they traveled down through and then spread out from there. They traveled to Oceania around 1600 BC to 500 CE, and that's, when we say Oceania, we're talking about like the Polynesian Islands, the Polynesian communities, also all the way to Easter Island. That's that furthest green arrow, the one closest to Chile. That would be Easter Island. That's the latest migration in terms of the spreading out of early Homo sapiens. So, why were modern humans able to move into so many different environments? There's a lot of questions in terms of that, but there's a really important set of evolutionary developments that allowed man to do this that no other animal has been able to do. This is truly a unique thing to Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens sapiens, than any other animal in the world. We cover the most amount of land space of any creature on Earth. So, how did we do that? What made us so special? Well, let's take a look at the reasons for that. So, and as you can see on the bottom there, in the timeline, we're seeing the movements of people. So, and look at how long it takes. Southwest Asia, they're in Southwest Asia, just kind of moving out of Africa. Not a lot, but a little bit. It takes them almost 60,000 years to get into mainland Afro-Eurasia. And they don't even take a step out of Africa for 100,000 years. That's pretty interesting. So language is the critical component, the most important component of man and Homo sapiens in general, their ability to make these kinds of movements. And I know you're probably going, well, what's language got to do with being able to live in Siberia? It's cold. Doesn't matter how much talking you do, it's still cold. But no, there is a really important reason for language and how language helped us to do the things we do. If you try to think about the game Pictionary. When you're drawing pictures on a wall to convey an idea, it takes a lot of guessing before you actually figure out what that is. Well, that's kind of how animals have a problem with communicating. They're using facial gestures and body language and some archaic kind of sounds, but they don't have true language. So being able to get the other person to understand what you mean is very difficult. Also, so it's the idea of exchanging very complex ideas with each other. The next thing that it allows is the sharing of ideas. We can now, with language, be able to speak a bunch of different complex ideas. Go down the hill to pick up a pint of milk isn't communicatable, but now it also means that the other person can store that and say, hey, down the hill there's Cumberland Farms, can pick up some milk, and oh, by the way, every time I go there, there's also a gas station. So now we're adding on to the information, and that being able to add more information on top of, so layering information, allows for each generation to add more and more stuff and be able to build up more and more technology, ideas on how to survive in different areas, medicinal plants that are safe to eat. Those kinds of things can be now extrapolated and stored by the very people in that community. Because they're swapping ideas, they kept finding different ways of doing things, new ways of doing things. So rather than just maybe making an arrow straight from a piece of wood, you can add an arrow by working the sinew, the tendons of an animal, and working those out. And how do you work it out? And so they're doing all those kinds of things, and that ended up leading to new ideas and new ways of living. So because of language, collective learning becomes possible. And like I said, it's that idea of storing lots of knowledge and skills that are unique to a community and being able to pass that on to generation. And it's that storage of understandings that makes a group of people a culture. So that's really important. No other animal can do this, can accumulate that kind of knowledge and those type of skills in abundance. They do a little bit. It's like, think about cats. You can't have a ratter cat unless the mom was a ratter. She teaches the little baby cats, little kittens, how to find and hunt rats. That's a skill she learned, and it doesn't get passed along if she doesn't give it to them. So that's a small one. We do that in immense ways. And it has, as you do a reading later from a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, which talks about the reason this language and collective learning becomes a really important component of Homo sapiens, the reason why we have to develop that skill, has a lot to do with how long the baby sits in the mother's stomach, and also how big the brain can develop, because it can't get too big or else the baby won't fit out of the mother. So the birthing process actually changes the nature of how people, how their brains store information. And that particular ability that's developed, in fact, at birth, is called collective learning. And that's exactly what human history is all about. It's the very thing that makes us unique, that we can study and look at the past and the future and pass that information on to the next generation and the next generation. So storing up and building on these new skills and new knowledge is really what set us on this cultural path of what we can entitle progress. We'll talk a little bit about the myth of progress later, but it is what allows progress to occur. So look at the pictures below, and you'll notice that we've got different ways of building things. And if you look really at the bottom to the Mexican pyramids there, and the Zimbabwe wall structure, it's actually woven, by the way. It's woven grass that makes that wall. It's pretty cool. And then look at the Kuwait towers. You can see some of the geometric similarity, some of the ideas that got us to get to that point is all found in these cultures early on. Figuring out how to build structures that stand really tall, and what kind of materials to use, and different ways to use that material. How did collective learning change human culture? Well, first, technology changes are going to be very, very slow. And it's much like, as we saw with the timeline in Big Arrow 1, how long it takes for, us to create for the universe to get created to the point where we actually make our sun and our earth and our galaxy, and then how long it takes, but not as long to make living creatures, and then so on and so forth. This is kind of how human learning works. So it moves real slow, and then things start to pick up, and the pace increases at exponential rates. It's actually, it's a mathematical equation, kind of goes in half. It starts cutting everything in half. So about 100,000 years ago, we start to see that race forward. Now, of course, it's not going to be if you think about it, we're not going to stop being hunters and gatherers till about, well, we're still, I mean, there's still some groups, but really a total a worldwide turnover seems to occur about 1000 BCE. You know, give and take that, because about 3000 BCE we've got in Afro-Eurasia very strong and powerfully built complex culture. But early on it takes those kind of lengths, so it's going to take about 90,000 years before we even get to agriculture. So evidence appears that during that time of humans living in Eastern and Central and Southern Africa, and they start to make more advanced tools and a variety of different tools. They start experimenting with body decoration and abstract symbols, art, those kinds of things. One of our samples that we're going to look at is from Blombos Cave, and let's go take a look directly there. So there's some remains that are found in that cave of some complex culture. That's around 90,000 years ago. And there's a nice little picture of the cave there. They're a seaside camp. They started making sharp stone spear points using methods that appeared only in Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, at around 50,000 years or more later. And that's really interesting to note, that they're doing that early, and that information doesn't necessarily move steadily out, because remember, it depends on who's migrating out there and if they actually have that information at their fingertips or in their brains. They started making objects from bone, and the earliest use of this material is actually from this point. So none of the other hominin groups up to this point are using bone to make things from. They're only using stones and wood. We find scored bits of bones and ochre. And ochre is a red. It's a red powder when mixed with, especially egg yolk. That's how they used to make paint. So it's actually the pigment to make paint. And we think that these scratch marks on these bits of bone must have had some kind of symbolic meaning. It could have been counting, but it could have been anything. We can't tell. So this acceleration starts to occur. So at about 40,000 years ago, we start to see evidence of true art, like real art. And the engraved horse there from France, in southern France, we're going to, through ABC Clio, actually take a trip through that cave, a virtual trip through the cave. And that image right there is about 31,000 years old. It's kind of amazing how long this stuff has lasted. Below, there's a little sculpture, stone sculpture of the Venus in Russia, and she's dated to about 23,000 years ago. And it's a woven headgear for baskets. They began to create both naturalistic and abstract art. And that's really important to note here, that it's not just them painting things they see, but they are being able to imagine and predict and make mythical kind of concepts, these fictional kind of concepts. And so they're obviously using story and symbols now very heavily, which also allows for a complexity of conceptions. They're making more specialized tools. They're also weaving and knotting fiber. This is the first time that this is occurring. So the idea of wearing clothing that's completely made, not just made from animal skins, we're seeing that happen here. They're starting to decorate their clothing. They're starting to put beads and shells and feathers and all, painting the clothing. So it's making it individualistic, and those colors are symbolic for those communities, and so they're conveying ideas about themselves through their way of decorating it. They're making jewelry, and they're also building semi-permanent structures. When I say semi-permanent, that means they can stay in a place for a while, but they are still hunters and gatherers, so you can't stay forever in a location for or else you run out of food sources. So that's why they're semi-permanent. Now, were there other surviving hominins changing in the same way as Homo sapiens? Well, we know that Neanderthals lived at the same time as humans. They're living more northern area. They're living in really Europe, and they're kind of using Southwest Asia as a timeshare. And when I say timeshare, I mean they go down there during certain seasons, and then as it started to warm up again, they'd move back up into Europe. Europe, mind you, is locked up in the Ice Age, hence why they didn't move up into Europe immediately. The hominins, the Homo sapiens didn't move up into Europe immediately because it was locked up in the Ice Age. So Neanderthal's a pretty tough guy. Those hominins could survive in that location. And then at that same time, when they move up north into Europe, Homo sapiens seem to be moving up into Southwest Asia and using that land, probably following animal bands that they hunted during that time. And when they moved back, when they would migrate, the animal tribes would move back down, the Homo sapiens would move with them. So really, they probably weren't encountering in the Ice Age period the Neanderthals too frequently. They also had a long record of surviving both cold and warm environments. And like I said, some of their unique characteristics, that they'll have this big brow ridge, frontal brow area, and a bigger, wider nose. And the reason they have that is really to make sure that when they're in the colder climates, because you're talking sub-zero temperatures, you don't, if you're breathing in air, you would actually freeze the brain, literally. So you need more padding. They had more circulation, more blood flow in the face to keep their face warm, to make sure the brain didn't freeze. That wide brimmed nose was about warming the air as you breathed it in so your lungs didn't freeze. But somewhere around 28,000 years ago, so even though they're so successful in their adaptation, around 28,000 years ago they disappear. And we're going to address that much more heavily as we go along in this first part of the unit. So, did we meet them? Yes. Most definitely, in some format. So, if you look at the green circle there, that's the approximate geographical range of Neanderthals, and that was, around 100,000 years ago. They're living there to 28,000 years ago. Now, there's Homo sapiens range. Remember, they went to Europe at about 40,000 years ago, so they were definitely in contact with Neanderthals. How they interacted and the way they approached them may have been very different from what we might think of their interaction, and we'll read and talk more about that later. But let me just talk about where Homo erectus was and where he last survived. So there's on the Pacific Islands, Homo erectus, the last surviving one. Did Homo sapiens meet Homo erectus? Absolutely. Members of the two species probably met out there in Southeast Asia. The last traces, the last physical evidence of Homo erectus being alive was around, interestingly enough, and strangely enough, 28,000 years ago. So what's happening between around 60 to 40,000 years ago that seems to be wiping out all of the hominin groups except for us? And that's a question you should write down in your notes right now, because it's something that we want to consider. It may have implications, let me put it this way, it may have implications regarding Homo sapiens' nature. So, remember Java Man? That's where he was found, right there. And Homo sapiens were definitely living in that region at that time. So, what do you think would have happened when Homo sapiens met Neanderthal and Homo erectus? And this is one of those questions that you're going to have to be able to answer later. Is there a real answer? And when I say real answer, I mean a defined, scientific, they've got it figured out answer. Absolutely not. But I want you to make an educated guess, a hypothesis as to why. And consider the implications behind that. So, would they have learned from each other? Could they have learned from each other? Possibly, right? Could they have fought? Maybe they traded? Did they eat each other? Did they mate? So did they have children together, willingly or unwillingly? Homo sapiens and other species. We're not sure what might have happened. As I was saying before, there's not a real answer as to did they fight, did they mate, did they trade, but we do know that when they finally meet, the other two hominin groups did die out. Now, does that mean that the hominins might have killed them? Well, that's a possibility, but you also have to keep in mind that so did many other larger animals, the megafauna and the megaflora, in fact. So flora being plants, fauna being animals, are also dying out at this time. The woolly mammoth, for example. Neanderthal was very famous for hunting the woolly mammoth, and in fact many of the injuries that are found on Neanderthals are similar to that of a rodeo cowboy. They were obviously coming in real close and attacking them head on. And so if they were really good at that, and they big old bodybuilders, and their main food source is dying out, well, that could have had implications in terms of their survivability as well. So it didn't necessarily have to mean that Homo sapiens killed them. So just keep that part in mind. What about these extinctions, though? All these other groups, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals are dying out, Homo erectus is dying out, the woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed tigers, the dire wolf, all of those animals are dying off. They're going extinct at the end of the Ice Age, because the Ice Age is now coming to an end. That's happening at that time. If they died out, what does that suggest about us as a species and our ability to adapt? Now, before I move forward here, that last question, if you didn't get it, go back and write it down. But that last question is a constructed response question. I will expect a intro paragraph, a body paragraph, at least one, minimum, and a conclusion paragraph answering that question as best as you can based on what you know so far. So, please remember that and get that assignment done. But let's review a few ideas about what occurred in Big Era 2, and this should help you a little bit with that question. Humans appear and they start talking. So they start using language. Therefore, they start being able to share new ideas and build up a store of those ideas, which we call culture. They learn to live in a variety of different environments, and they migrated to all the world's major land masses and many of the islands. So, what do you think is so special about Homo sapiens? Why does human history matter? And what does it mean to be human? These 3 questions are key to the first part of our study, this first part of the study of humans and how they get into culture and what human history and all the other stuff. So these are the foundational ideas that we want to first address. We will be addressing other issues, a couple other major issues such as race. How did that develop? How did different cultures create different ideas about the world? Those kinds of things. So, but that's it for this lecture, and we will have another one when we get to Big Era 3.